This program has been made possible by the generous support of these organizations at Stanford University: Office of the Provost, Institute for International Studies, School of Humanities and Sciences, and Ambassador and Mrs. L.W. Lane, Jr., Donald L. Lucas, the Russell Family Foundation, Ronald P. Spogli. International Environmental Politics was offered to students at Stanford University as part of the International Policy Studies program during Winter Quarter 2001.
What I'll do is sort of start with a little bit of kind of the standard economic theory, but what I want you guys thinking about is what's the relationship of free trade and the environment? You also read the NAFTA article, or hopefully some of you did, since you were all, I know, working on your papers to hand in. Maybe you didn't have a chance to read it, but the interesting article on NAFTA, which we'll talk about a bit, particularly interesting in light of how you do the paper, okay? Because it was trying to evaluate NAFTA, trying to evaluate has NAFTA had a good effect, and I think they do an interesting job on trying to evaluate it against several different criteria, and we can evaluate in turn whether they did a good job or not. So first, let's just walk through a sort of what's the kind of the classic, a really oversimplified sort of classic version of the kind of economics of trade, okay? To just hopefully this is pretty, people are familiar with this. How many of you have had economics classes, some economics? Okay, so macro, has everybody had macro? Okay, so this should make sense, and you can probably even correct it. But let's, come on in, Mark. So this is, let's just start with, this is basically, the comparative advantage part on the top, right? This is, if you take we'll just, keep it simple with a two-economy world, in which you have each country is autarkic, right? That is, it's self-sufficient, it makes its own stuff. There's no trade across borders, for starters. And we have some per-worker productivity rates where Americans can produce cars. They can produce each American. We're not only two economies, only two countries in this world, but all people are equal, right? There's no differences among people. And so each person in the American economy can produce 4 cars in the course of a year, right? They work full time, and they can produce a ton of oranges. And in Mexico, they can produce 1 car and 2 tons of oranges. Why the difference? Just first of all, kind of tell me a story that's not racist about what the differences are here. Eli.
Productivity of labor, maybe one country's more technically productivity, and the other is more has a lot more labor-intensive productivity. Okay,
so and why would again? Let's assume away any racial differences. What would explain that? Okay, so you have a different education system, right? So you have a better education. That more money's been spent on educating the workforce in the United States. What else?
The U.S. has more capital.
Okay, U.S. has more capital, so we actually can put more money in things that are manufactured goods. Okay, fair enough. What else? What else might explain the differences? Especially for oranges. Climate. Just natural endowments, right? Okay, so you could have two very distinct comparative advantages, right? This is kind of Ricardian economics 101, right? But we want to also think in an environmental class, this is the part that you never see, you know, in an economics 101 class, is what are the environmental impacts of these different behaviors for each worker over the course of a year. And in the U.S. economy, and again, I pulled these numbers out of thin air, right? But you could go out and do the research to figure out what the real numbers are, and you would imagine some differences, and I don't know how they would look. But we have, so again, this is per worker, right? So this is, in producing these 4 cars, the American worker produces 2 tons of CO2, or half a ton of CO2 per car produced, right? In fact, there's been studies by OECD on embedded carbon, right? Embedded CO2. That is, when you buy a Nissan or a Toyota from Japan, who should be responsible for the CO2 emitted in the production of that car? Not emitted when you use it, but in production, right? When you produce it in a factory that's burning electricity to run the equipment. That's producing CO2. Should Japan be responsible for that, or should the Americans be responsible? Right? It's produced for export to the U.S. Should we be kind of responsible for, in a global sense, under the Framework Convention on Climate Change, should we be responsible for those CO2 emissions, or should Japan? Right? You might think about how there's a lot of embedded carbon in a lot of the goods we buy through import. Who should be responsible? In the accounting process, should imports and exports be kind of subtracted and added to decide how much CO2 we produced last year? So that's something to think about. So half a ton per car, whereas in Mexico there's 3 tons per car, right? You see, I'm just doing the quick math. This is 2 tons for 4 cars and 3 tons for 1 car. So much, and again, I just made these numbers up so we'd have some nice dramatic differences. But what could explain that? And ditto over on the pesticide side, right? We produce 1 ton of pesticide for each ton of oranges. We use 1 ton of pesticide for each ton of oranges, and in Mexico they use 4 tons for 2 tons of oranges. You know, again, I'm just making these up. Let's not go into what kind of the underlying assumptions are, because there are none. I just pulled them out of thin air. But what might explain those differences? Alex?
Well, the U.S. has better capital and more income, so they can produce their goods more efficiently and more environmentally efficiently.
Okay, so
that kind of explains the 2 tons versus 3 tons.
Okay, so that we produce more efficiently. Why do we produce more efficiently? We have more capital?
Because since we have more income, we're going to have stronger environmental regulations.
Okay, so one is if we believe the Kuznets argument, right? There's a Kuznets curve that says as you get rich, you get green. Okay, so if we buy Kuznets argument, then we say, okay, so we're rich people who live in America. We voice our environmental protection is a luxury good. We demand it from our Congress, and we get it in exchange. And so there's that efficiency. Risa?
I think also the United States has a lot more technological advancements.
Okay.
Probably due to capital as well.
Okay, so the power plants that are producing the energy that's going into these cars are power plants that were devised in the 1970s and built in the 1980s and built quite efficiently. You know, I mean, maybe these are nuclear plants, right? Part of the reason we don't produce, if this was France, right, this number would be very low for Renaults, right? Because all of their energy is not CO2. We would have some other, we might want to measure uranium, disposed uranium or whatever, radioactive waste as one of our other categories. But so it depends on just the kind of the power plant stock, et cetera, okay? You can come this way. So that's on the one side. What about the pesticide thing? How do we kind of tell stories? And again, we could tell multiple stories on anything. Why would we use so much less pesticides than in Mexico? And again, it might be the other way, and I'm not kind of committed to one way or the other. But why would we use half as much pesticides per ton of oranges produced? How can you explain that?
We can afford better quality pesticide.
Okay, we can afford better quality pesticides. So Allie?
I feel that we've got more education about how much pesticide you're supposed to use.
Okay, that turns out that it's produced by an American company that prints the instructions in English, and a lot of the poorer farmers in Mexico can't read the instructions, so they put on extra because they want to make sure they got enough, right? Better to put on, or at least from a point of view of producing oranges, better to put on too much than not enough. Malika and then Kim?
Mexico might subsidize pesticides for
Okay, you might have government intervening in the market here, right? to fund pesticide, to help. I mean, especially, and I don't know if it's true, but one can make a story about in Mexico, right? You have Pemex, the Petroleum of Mexico. That's part of that's quasi-governmental, right? A lot of pesticides are petroleum-based, so the government wants to kind of support Pemex. And so they subsidize the use of pesticides. Okay, so that again, maybe that story's not right, but you can tell all these stories about the way governments are intervening in the marketplace, either in positive ways, as Alex was saying, in terms of environmental regulation, or in negative ways in terms of subsidizing things that we don't want more of. Kim.
I was going to say the U.S. will have a greater market for organic products.
Okay. Fair enough. So in some ways, this ton of oranges might be sort of. This is the average ton of oranges, and a quarter of that might be, 500 pounds might be organic oranges because there's a big organic market in the United States. And so that we're producing this ton of pesticides. We're actually, on the non-organic produce, we're just as bad as Mexico, maybe even worse, but we sell organic as well. Okay, fair enough. Emily?
This is probably not true, but perhaps we have...
None of what we've said so far is true, so it doesn't matter.
Perhaps we have a better strain of oranges that's more resistant.
Okay.
So we don't need to use as much stuff.
Yeah, great. So that we may actually have fewer pests. So this might be kind of the corresponding thing to why they can produce more fruit in Mexico because it's better land, but they might have more pests to deal with in the tropics than we do in Florida and California, right? Okay. So, and again, you would have, if you want environmental impacts, you really need 15 different categories of all the environmental impacts of each of these things, et cetera, right? You need to worry about where the plastics go, where the mercury goes, all the things that go into producing a car, you need to sort all that out. This is ecological footprint, right, analysis that you'd want to do. But this is just a simple version. So that's all per worker stuff. So now we have a closed economy. 2,000 workers. Again, we're just keeping it simple because my mind's too small to figure out a complex version. So we have 2,000 workers. We just split them evenly. Again, it's easier than figuring out how the market would work to sort out how many oranges and cars we want in each country. But in the U.S., we split the workers half and half, and we put 1,000 in each sector, right? And we produce 4,000. A bunch of thin people. They don't have scurvy because or they do have scurvy because there's not enough oranges to go around, but they've got 4 cars in the garage, right? So you have Americans with lots of cars and not much oranges, and Mexicans with very few cars but lots of oranges, right? So, and then the standard argument is that okay, so there's 5,000 cars and 5,000 cars in the world and 3,000 tons of oranges in the world, right? And then so what are basically this is just the same chart multiplied by 1,000, right, that we saw before. If you just split the economy that way. So that's the kind of closed economy world. The bottom line is, let's look at, we'll keep that up there. Let's see if I can get it all on the screen at the same time. Well, that's the closed economy at the top of the screen. And then let's look at an open economy. And let's just first start with with just the economic part, right? Here, well, that chart is wrong, isn't it? This is economics we're talking about. So assume this number was over in this box, right? Just assume I had made the graph correctly. That's the economist's view. So that each produces what it does best, right? In standard comparative advantage kind of argument, assume that Americans produce cars more efficiently from a point of view of labor, right? and Mexico produces oranges more efficiently. So we should have all the workers in Mexico, the 2,000 workers in Mexico, producing 2 tons of oranges a year, so producing 4,000 tons of oranges, and Americans, the 2,000 American workers producing 4 cars a year, for each of them producing 8,000. And the world all of a sudden has 8,000 cars instead of 5,000, and 4,000 oranges instead of 3,000. Good world, right? More is better, right? I mean, hey, everybody can have a car. Everybody can have two cars, right? Everybody can have 2 tons of oranges instead of just 1 or whatever, right? So we work out all this stuff. So we now have a world in which there's more stuff. That's the standard argument, right? That's the liberal orthodox view of why we should allow free trade to happen, right? And so then you say, well, okay, but then we need to worry about what happens environmentally. And notice that we have, in terms of environmentally, we now have 4,000 tons of CO2, whereas before, what did we have? Right, we had 5,000, so we're less CO2, right? It's a good thing. And this, again, I tried to set this example up to say maybe in some cases free trade is a good thing, right? If comparative economic advantage also has some environmental benefits, right? Again, this 8,000 tons should be over here. 8,000 tons of pesticide, more pesticide than we used to have, right? So less CO2 emissions, but more pesticide. And the other thing is, what about this extra CO2 here, right? We have more cars. We've used less CO2 to produce them, but there are more cars, and when they drive on the road and burn gasoline, they produce a lot of CO2 too, right? So we have 3,000 more cars that are all driving around at 25 miles to the gallon or whatever it is. I mean, this new Unimog, people see that last week in the New York Times. 20 feet long, 10 feet high. It's like a military thing. It's like driving, owning your own little fire engine. What? Yeah, right. Yeah, it's an 18-wheeler. Right, exactly. So, there's an option on it, which is you can have the smokestack come up next to the front, and go up instead of out the tailpipe down below. So you can really look like an 18-wheeler. I think the CB is extra, but so this 20-foot long, it's just. I disown this country, quite honestly, that we can produce these huge cars. I mean, the best story I have is a friend of mine who's an environmentalist who lives up in Portland, drove down from Portland to give a guest lecture in Eugene in his, I don't know, it's like a 52 Chevy. And I said, so what kind of, and this thing is like, you think Volvos sit on the road. This thing is like, 16 tons, sort of, just this old Chevy that sits on the road. He gets the same mileage as I get in my 89 Nissan Sentra. 30 some odd miles to the gallon. Right? This should worry you that the technology has not changed that much, right? Over 40 years, that you have the same kind of, really much heavier. In fact, it's gotten worse, right? Because my Nissan Sentra, I mean, I can lift it with one hand, and his car is, 3 times as heavy, and he gets the same miles per gallon that I get. This is worrisome. Okay, so that's sort of the short form of this kind of whole argument, right? So that's sort of why we think free trade is good from an economic point of view, and then to sort of challenge, I think the notion that a lot of you probably come in with. I mean, how many people think free trade is bad for the environment? And you just kind of, what's your kind of priors? Just if you're talking at one of your frat parties this past weekend, and somebody said, oh, you do environmental stuff, so is free trade bad for the environment? How many people would have said, yes, it's bad? Okay, how many people would have said, yes, it's good? That free trade is good for the environment? Okay, a couple. Okay, good, so that'll allow us to have a good discussion about this. I think in general in the enviro community, what's the general view? Bad thing for the environment, right? And so what I want to kind of do is push us to think through what it is. And that one way to think about this, sometimes, again, I've been trying to push the idea that, actually we'll push the idea as we get towards the end of the course of that the world is actually more complex than the simple binary, pull one lever and something else comes out the other end. So over here we have environmental quality, right? the thing we care about, our dependent variable, right? The thing we care about. Over here we have free trade. Okay, and more important, this isn't a variable yet. Really, we'd want to have amount of trade moving from a completely closed economy, the Cuban economy, to a completely open economy, the EU, right? That's the variation we have in this left-hand side variable, right? And now I want to, here's this space between here and here. And we want to know what the net effect of this, of increasing this as free trade goes up, what happens to environmental quality. And I think you have one article, the, what is it, Logsdon and Hughes or something, the one on NAFTA that you read for today, that gives you one case, right? A case of what happened in NAFTA. Think about the other cases, though, and some of you are thinking about them. Think about the European Union, right? European Union, as states join the European Union is at the extreme end of this free trade case, right? Completely free trade, no borders, right? And again, think about what would be another case of free trade where you could look at free trade. Well, what about trade within the United States? Right? Between states within the United States. Because if you look at states within the US, they're about the size of most European countries, right? When I was in Norway, I was surprised to find that Norway demographically is the same as Oregon. Right? About 4 million people in both. And I'm thinking, Oregon, this is a state that most people in the United States don't even know how to pronounce the name correctly, right? And it's the same size as a not insignificant country in Europe, right? So to think about, wait, in the US we have free trade among all the states in the Union, right? There's no borders. You don't have to pay any tariffs to go from California to Oregon and vice versa, right? So to think about what does that mean? It also challenges you to think, well, so free trade is just about deciding where the limits of competitive advantage are, right? Because even within a state, you could say between towns, why isn't each town self-sufficient? And then go lower, right? Why isn't each family self-sufficient, right? So if you just have a town that's trading, then you're saying, okay, it's all right to have free trade between people. What about between towns, between counties, between states, between countries? Why do we decide that some historical artifact, like the boundaries of countries, is a good place to end trade, right? I think it's sort of, at the extreme, in one of the arguments is bioregionalism, right? The bioregional argument says, kind of figure out a watershed and keep trade within that watershed. Unfortunately, CO2 and stuff goes over the border, and you might have other problems, but there's sort of some, instead of a kind of historical and geopolitical sort of basis for what the basis of free trade is, try to think about what's a kind of ecological basis for where free trade should be limited to, okay? So let's think about what's the relationship between free trade and environment. And what I want to do is I'd like to fill this whole area in with a bunch of different arrows going through different pathways, the different ways that when you increase trade, something happens to the environment. Either it gets better or worse. So we'll start out, Hanky, you said you think free trade's a good thing for the environment. So give me a positive one for starters. And then you can backtrack later, because what we're going to talk about here is a net effect, right? That we assume, Alex is interested in this one, all right? Okay, so we assume that there's going to be some positives and some negatives, and I'd like to get them all up. Then we can do some empirical work to figure out which are the big ones and which are the small ones, and then figure out what the net effect is. So Hanky, what's a one for starter that's a positive way that free trade helps the environment?
Okay. Well, free trade leads to economic growth, and with the increase in income, people have greater concern for environmental quality.
Okay, so one is economic growth, okay, which leads to increased income, which leads to, via Kuznets, right, which leads to increased environmental concern, which leads to increased lobbying. In the general sense of you have more money at the end of the year come tax time to give to the Nature Conservancy or whatever, right? And that leads to improved environmental quality. Okay, so that's a causal pathway, right? In terms of the things I'm thinking about, the data stuff in your papers is about this and that, right? That's your first place, is you have to, but then you want to show this process by which kind of the logic of why you think if you show that when free trade goes up, environmental quality goes up, what's the process? And notice that you could then add data here to say, okay, when we increase free trade, did growth go up? Did we see economic growth in response? That was due to the increase in free trade, not just due to random variation, right? Then did we see incomes go up, average income? Did we see environmental concern go up, right? Among the rich, were the rich more concerned than the poor in that country? And then, or were they more concerned than they used to be? Did we see some kind of lobbying by which the government got the message, right? So that one can imagine that this is sort of less of a causal pathway in some dictatorship than in a democracy, right? That because there's a breakdown here, all these other things can happen, but there's a breakdown here. Okay, so that's one. So great. And notice that at some points along here, we're going to have causal pathways where it gets halfway and then changes direction, right? That is, we could have another line coming down from any of the other places along here. Okay, so what are someone who thinks negatively about it? Eli, or positively? I don't know.
Positive.
Okay.
I was going to say the lowering of like trade barriers and like tariffs and stuff like that, you get more dissemination of cleaner technologies and transfer of information about cleaner technologies.
So, tech info transfer. Okay, keep going. I am not at the environment yet.
Okay.
So I now have cleaner technology and more information about how to use it, how to use my pesticides correctly, going back to our example.
And therefore, by implementing these cheaper, cleaner technologies due to lowering of trade barriers, they can implement them cheaper and thus lower their environmental damage from goods they produce.
Okay, so
It's neat implementation sort of in there.
okay, so use/implement cleaner techs, right? Very good, right? So it might be that that the technology that's moving, unless we have unless either economically cleaner technology is always better, which need not be, right? Or B, that we have some kind of regulation on it, right? So we'll have dirtier tech here, right? And so this is, well, that's just, this can just go all the way across. So that's a positive thing, but it could be a negative, right? Yeah, Megan.
Generally, governments that are in trade agreements with other governments have more of a stake in remaining politically positive relations with those governments. So it's easier to impose sanctions on open economies if they don't adhere to international environmental legislation.
Okay.
They don't impose ones. Like, we have nothing to hold against Cuba if they don't implement some sort of environmental legislation.
Okay, so free trade is kind of, the more trade there is, the increased interdependence, right? In political science, 35 terms, right? Increased interdependence between countries, sort of, which causes increased opportunity to sanction. And then assuming that the powerful country is more environmental than the weak country, right? Again, we have to make some assumptions about which way these are going to flow. So increased pressure for environmental protection, but it could be the opposite, right? If the Soviet Union had won, given their past history with environmental protection, they might have forced countries to start producing in a way that was less environmentally sound, right? Okay, and so this might be a positive, and actually this was all positive here, right? Okay, Kate?
Well, companies might shift their production to countries with lower environmental standards where they can produce them cheaper.
Okay, so free trade is not just trading goods, but free movement of capital, right? So you have an This is the pollution haven argument, right? That companies move capital to areas where their costs of production are lowest. One cost of production is compliance with environmental regulations, right? So you have movement towards pollution havens, increase in dirty production. Okay, let's take that one on because it's a common argument, right? What does von Moltke say about this? Or sort of is this like what's the underlying necessities of this relationship between that is what has to be true for a pollution haven hypothesis to be true? Eli.
The capital costs of relocation have to be less than sort of the environmental savings they get.
Right. Okay. And
Isn't always necessarily the case.
which isn't necessarily the case, right? So that the environmental costs have to be the relocation costs have to be less than the environmental protection costs, or the whatever the environmental protection benefit is. And notice that one of the things, this is one of the things where you can kind of use back of the envelope calculations, right? You should try to think about that. When somebody makes an argument, say, let me think through the logic of that. So how would you think through the logic of whether that's likely to be true most of the time or not? On average, okay, so Eli says, well, your costs of relocation have to be less than the benefits of the benefits of not complying with environmental laws, right? Effectively. So, how often do you think that's true, and how do you think about how often it's true? What are the factors you need to consider, Eli?
Well, what I would say, I mean, like, if you have a plant that's worth a couple $1 billion, to like reconstruct that in a country, thus incurring like a $3 billion cost, is probably not going to be offset by the savings they get from like more lax environmental laws, which
Okay.
are more on like the scale of like millions, perhaps.
Okay, how do we calculate the benefits of not having to comply with expensive environmental laws? How would we think about what that number, how do we get at that million? You're saying it's $1 million, but what do we think about?
The increased pollution they can emit in the production, like they don't have to put scrubbers on their plants or something like that.
Okay, but how do you measure that quantitatively, Risa?
Maybe like if they don't have to use scrubbers, like subtract the amount of money they'd have to spend on environmental protection things like getting scrubbers or getting paying inspectors to license them and things like that.
Right. And you got to figure out what that looks like on a per unit basis, right? You have to say, so think about, I don't know, this shirt, right? And we think about what are the components of this shirt. What was the cost of production of this shirt? Because I bought it for $19.95 down at J. Crew, right? Okay, of that $19.95, what fraction is labor? What do you figure? Especially on this, right? 99%, right? What, Eli?
I was going to say it depends on where it's made.
Depends on where it's made, so we can check the collar here and find out it's probably made in Indonesia, right, or Malaysia or something like that. This is why Fritz Hollings from South Carolina is so mad about free trade, because it's going to put a lot of people out in South Carolina who do textile work out of work, right? Because those people are going to have to be retrained to be computer, technicians or something like that. But okay, assuming wherever it's made, what fraction of this is labor? What fraction is capital? Is like the plant, the power plant. Take those two together, whatever they are. What fraction total do you think they are? Give me an order of magnitude, Malika.
Less than 10%.
The labor and
Capital.
the capital is less than 10%. And what about labor?
No, it would be less than $2 to make, and labor plus capital.
Okay, and where does the rest of the money go?
To J. Crew.
Okay, fine. So one is we have this thing called profit we're going to have to worry about, right? But okay, so let's then say, okay, the cost of production of this shirt was $2. Let's take that. That seems reasonable. Okay, but that out of that $2, then how much? What if that's our total or that's our production cost of, whatever the labor and capital, and then we, how much more is the cost that we have to spend on capital? Like, what's just a rough order of guess about how much it adds to comply with American environmental laws in South Carolina versus Malaysian environmental laws? How much, if it's $2 total production cost, how much, what do you think is the difference in having to comply with smokestack scrubber laws? Like two more dollars or 2 more pennies?
Probably 2 pennies.
What do, anybody care to disagree? Hard to know, right? What, Kim?
I think it would be more expensive, especially in the beginning, because you need capital transfers, technology transfers.
Okay, so tell me more about that.
Like if you're talking about smokestacks, like the first year you might have to completely rip out the smokestacks you have and put in a different type
Okay.
of smokestack.
But we're going to amortize this over a bunch of shirts, right? We're going to have to spread the cost, you know, just like any capital cost, the whatever, the $2 for the shirt includes some amortized cost of some plant that was built a long time ago. So we're going to amortize that too. We're not going to just impose it on all the first few shirts. But I think it doesn't, I mean, I don't know what it is in any given case. Sarah?
What about the, I mean, it seems like labor would be a lot more.
That on average, one would tend to think that labor, and certainly labor and capital together, would be a pretty large fraction relative to the compliance cost with environmental laws, right? That environmental laws, compliance with environmental laws should be net on average probably a small fraction, right? So that on average, and in certain cases that might not be the case, right? In agricultural production, compliance with environmental laws might be quite expensive, right? Where pesticides are an important factor in how you use them might play a role. But in certainly a lot of manufacturers, we could go do the research and look at kind of what fraction does environmental compliance costs impose. And I think as a first approximation, my understanding is that it doesn't tend to be like 50%. It tends to be relatively small. And therefore, on average, what Eli's saying is it tends to be that one tends not to move based on environmental compliance costs. One might move on the basis of labor costs, and particularly not labor costs, right? But what? Do we care about wages specifically? What do we care about, Hanky? Productivity, right? It's not how much I get paid, it's how many total dollars you have to pay me to produce a car. You don't care about my hourly wage. If I'm a slow worker, if Ashley and I are both slow worker, that we work at the same rate, but Ashley gets paid more, who do you want to hire? You want to hire me, right? Because if we're working at the same rate and I can produce the same thing in the same amount of time, but you pay me less, that's all you care about. You don't, you care about work per dollar, not dollars per hour, right? So that you may well be influenced by the productivity differentials, right? And so one of the reasons why you can explain the absence of this great sucking sound that Ross Perot talked about, right, was that, in fact, yes, wages are hugely different between Mexico and here. But productivity may not be so different, and especially when you add in the stickiness of factories, right? That it costs a lot to move a factory to do all that. And so one of the things there to think about then is let's imagine for a minute that you moved a factory. So Nike all of a sudden says, "Hups, need a new sweatshop. Where am I going to build it?" Right? Just saw a nice little thing. Nike. I think this is true. This is one of those things. Internet stories you're never quite sure about, right? But where a guy Nike now has an ID shoe. Yeah, he wanted to. You can add any name you want. So what was it, Emily?
Sweatshop.
He wanted to have. You can write. You could have your shoe with the little swoosh, and on the swoosh or right under it could say, Ron Mitchell or whatever, right? And this guy sent in to have it say sweatshop. Guess what? They turned him down. Okay, so you have, so you're going to move this, you're going to create a new sweatshop somewhere, right? And you do it. Now, think about the environmental stuff. Like if you're all going to run, be CEOs of big corporations when you guys grow up. And you're setting up your shop. Like think about McDonald's. Let's take a classic example of a place that's setting up shops all over the world, right? When they set up a shop in Mexico City, what does it look like? What does it look like? What's the best estimate of what a McDonald's looks like? It looks exactly like the one here, right? The outside, the physical space. But on average, why do you, okay, you create the physical space because that's what McDonald's sells, right, is this notion that it's the same. But isn't it what they're selling is also the same inside too? You want the same burger. When you're in Paris, you do not want to have what they call a sandwich over in France, right? You want to have a hamburger, the way it tastes in the middle of Iowa, right? That's what you're buying. That's why you're paying whatever it is, $15 for a, McCheese or something over in Paris, right? Because you want the same thing. What does that mean in terms of environment? Like when you buy a franchise from McDonald's and you're buying a franchise from McDonald's in Bolivia, what do you think it looks like? It's the same damn, pile this high of instructions on how to run a McDonald's franchise, right? Which probably has, not because they care about the environment, but just because it's, kind of in terms of standard operating procedures, it's probably easier to have one manual for all McDonald's franchises rather than one for clean countries and one for dirty countries, right? That try to take advantage of the environmental laws, right? That is how you dispose of the wrappers and the waste is probably done the same, at least up to the door of the McDonald's in each country. Now, beyond that, we might have problems. But the part that McDonald's is responsible for, one can assume bureaucracies do standard operating procedures. They operate the same way wherever they are. That on average, if you think about whether the Nike, or whether the McDonald's in Bolivia looks more like the McDonald's in Peoria than it does like the taqueria in Bolivia. It probably looks more like the McDonald's in Peoria than the taqueria in Bolivia, right? As a first approximation. So to think about, as capital moves, there may be, and again, I'm not trying to push one side or the other. I think I probably push that free trade may not be as bad as it is often argued, just to get you thinking the other way, right? And I'm not kind of making sort of empirical claims about which it is, but I want to get you thinking about how it might work the opposite way. So free trade may cause sort of, this is somewhat the tech transfer one, but corporate movement, the other version of pollution havens, but sort of a corporate culture transfer. And to the extent that's occurring from the developed world, where, going back to Henke's point, where we have higher environmental concern and certain sort of things that have been developed within a world in which the environment has to be protected because of regulation, not because of the goodness of their heart. So this might have a positive effect. Again, just to kind of say there's a lot going on here. Diana.
Just another, I don't know if it's even exactly negative, but you're talking about corporate culture. I mean, the fact that McDonald's uses a certain set of chemicals in every
every burger.
Yeah, to make them all taste the same, and maybe the chemical regulations in wherever Bolivia are they're less they're less safe or something. The chemical compounds less pure. I don't know where you would go with that, but corporate culture is not always positive.
Okay, so there are a couple things there. One is this. There's also what's called in economic terms penetration, right? In the sense of that we convince people that they should buy the goods and services that we in America have to sell them, right? So Coke, Pepsi, McDonald's, all of those things. So penetration with environmentally unsound goods, right? So regardless of the pollution level coming out of the taqueria versus the McDonald's that are side by side in Bolivia, right? Forget the pollution levels, think about what product is coming out. That a taqueria that merely, where you go up, you walk up and you get, a burrito that's with beans and a corn tortilla that's handed to you without, 15 pounds of waste paper all around it to make sure it's hermetically sealed and there's no germs, except when the guy who was making it sneezed on it, right? When you go, I'm always like, especially fast food culture is the most dramatic. Even over at Tressler, you go in, you get food, 5 minutes later you finished eating lunch, and you throw half of it, even if you clean your plate, there's at least as much waste going into the garbage can as there is in the food you just ate, right? All those things. When people, ask you, you walk down to the corner store and they say, do you want a bag with that? And you're thinking, what, I can't carry the milk and the butter, in my hands down the street, and then even when you get it home, right? Think of all the wrapping around the milk and the butter, right? so that you have this penetration with environmentally unsound goods. Okay, so there's sort of a change in what's purchased. Emily.
I'm sort of confused on your corporate argument.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess I can just see the opposite. A country that's drilling for oil in Ecuador, something like Shell,
mm-hmm.
and they don't have the environmental regulations that, like, the country doesn't have the environmental regulations. So
Right.
the corporate, like, inertia of doing good things doesn't really hold up in situations like that. And so I would say that on average, I would think that it would go the opposite way.
Okay, so one has a balance here between these two things, right? In fact, it commented probably we could actually make an argument that it depends on what the parameters are of what Eli was talking about, right? When being in that other country is not, when the environmental costs of compliance are high, then we say, hey, there's big money to be made by writing a second book, about how to do corporate culture in that country. And in other places where the environmental costs aren't that high, you don't, right? There's no incentive to try to write two different operation manuals, right? So, but I think the other thing is, and again, there's another part here, which is, but if you're the head of Shell, and I mean, man's inhumanity to the environment never ceases to amaze me. I mean, people right now, the Dayaks in Borneo, like literally beheading and taking, ripping people's hearts out, literally doing this stuff today. I mean, kind of just say, okay, well, I guess I don't understand. I've lived in too cloistered a life where life is easy enough that I can't fathom what this is like. So when one thinks about, I like to think that if I'm the head of a CEO and I have certain value, I mean, the head of a certain the head of a CEO. No, that was what happened with the Dayaks, I think, was the head of the CEO was separated from the body of the CEO. When I'm the head of a corporation in America, or maybe the vice president or something, and they send me to another country, I don't all of a sudden lose my morals. I don't all of a sudden lose my American morals. One would hope that's true, and there probably is some aspect of that our morals are not strictly situation contingent, right? But they are partly, right? That there are, your morality about whether you tip somebody changes depending on what country you're in, and what the norms are in that country. So then, and so you can say, well, no, here the environment doesn't matter. It's clean. There aren't many people around. So a little bit of pollution won't matter. So maybe I don't care about the environment. So there's sort of, I think it works both ways, right? That is, one hopes that people who are, one sort of hopes that CEOs, increasingly as environmental movement kind of becomes more and more embedded, that CEOs say, yeah, I know we don't have to comply with the laws there, but I want you to do it anyway. That's what one hopes for. How often it happens empirically is another question. Diana.
I'm just going to bring up one other argument that you usually hear associated with free trade, and that's something like the WTO, the regulatory system governing free trade, and how it's bad for the environment.
Okay, what's the story there, Diana?
For instance, you've got innumerable ones. The one I'm most familiar with, you guys probably remember this from the beginning of class, is the dispute settlement body. That I think 3/4 of the time so far has ruled against any environmental protection in favor of, because it interferes with free trade, like the tuna dolphin 1 and 2, the sea turtles and all of that stuff.
Okay, so one thing is that it's, in some sense, it's not really quite a causal link, but unregulated free trade, that is within, one of the differences within between trade between states within the United States, right, and internationally, is that within the United States there's the regulation of trade is regulated by rules and laws and regulations that control all parts of the United States. So all producers within the United States have to produce under the same set of environmental laws, right? Whereas in the free trade case, in the international case, that's not true. That regulations can differ, and yet there seems to be very little effort being made to say, no, we have to make sure that that there's a level playing field here. And the way the WTO tends to define level playing field is strictly on an economic basis without concern for environmental protection. Okay? So this will tend, on average, to have a negative effect. Kim?
Another argument is that free trade kind of concentrates, I guess, environmental degradation. In the sense, like, before you have free trade, you have production of some product that requires timber in the U.S. and in some South American country where the Amazons exist. And so a little bit of forest is being depleted in the Amazons and a little bit in the U.S.
Okay.
But afterwards, the comparative advantage is for everything to be produced in that South American country. So all of a sudden you have complete depletion of the Amazon forest, that you can't recover.
Whereas we can still go hiking and skiing and snowboarding up in the nice trees that are left in Oregon. Okay. So there's a sort of, I don't know, again, this is not the binary model anymore here where we have one cause and one effect, but sort of, I don't know, we'll call this degradation concentration, right? Okay, so, not clear, is that a plus or a minus? Do we want the whole world to be like 30% degraded or do we want different parts of the world degraded in different ways? It's unclear to me.
Another example of that, like with NAFTA, is that, it created such a need for labor along the border region that it brought so many, increased population in that one area.
Okay.
To the extent that, the waste being produced was greater than the capacity, the infrastructure of that area to be able to deal with it and filter it out efficiently or, in a way that's ecologically sound. And so it exacerbated the ecological problems there.
Okay, so there's this kind of, it's not a linear model between population density and pollution damage. Okay, so we're going to definitely have more concentration, so we might well assume that that's negative. Let's think about Eli.
Oh, well, I want to comment on that too, but sort of on the border area there, since the 1960s, there had been sort of like a free trade area along, I forget what it was called, like
the maquiladoras.
The maquiladoras or something like that, so it wasn't just because then after that all got built up. But another thing I was going to say, a negative effect of free trade would be sort of what people call like regulatory chilling, or not sort of implementing environmental laws and using the non-implementation of environmental laws as sort of indirect subsidies for certain industries.
Okay. So it's sort of this pollution haven argument, right? It's just sort of non-implementation.
No, it's not necessarily pollution haven. Just like the U.S. not implementing certain environmental laws so that they'll be more competitive in the global market.
Right. In fact, the pollution haven argument can work two ways. One of which is, the first order. The first order is the corporation. Some big corporation just moves to Mexico, right? But the second, the smart corporations say, "Oh, I don't have to move. All I got to do is call up the president and say, hey, make me not move here. Like, make this easy for me here, right? So how, so it's all you have to do so that so that environmental regulations equilibrate, right? That essentially you're buying and selling environmental regulation, and you're lobbying for, don't implement it against me, we'll pad the pockets of your, of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, as the case may be, to make sure that we don't get regulated, okay? Or that we probably can't, it's probably too big a public relations disaster to actually get rid of the regulations, but just don't enforce them so tightly as you used to. We'll shake hands and you'll just let this pollution flow downstream, and we'll worry about the suit from the children who die 20 years from now. Let's think about two actually big parts, right? The first is let's think about the basic liberal orthodoxy, right? So free trade, comparative advantage. Where does that comparative advantage come from? A thing called competition, right? What does competition do?
It raises standards.
Raises standards? Well, competition, economic competition. What tends to happen when you have competition? Lowers prices. And lower prices because that those lower prices are evidence of what? Of less resources being used, right? I mean, you can't have lower prices without less resources somewhere, right? So on average, you should expect free trade increases competition. which, again, we have to make some assumptions about how much externalities are internalized in the market, right? We have to worry about how different resources are being priced: capital, labor, environmental protection. How are those all priced within the market? But assuming they are, increased competition leads to decreased use of resources, right? I mean, so go back to the car example of my friend. Do we use less resources, less physical resources in my Nissan Sentra than in his Chevy, 88 or whatever, Olds 88? Sure, lots less. That's the difference in the weight, right? So decreased use of resources, so that's a positive thing. So what's the negative part? Right up here, right? The per unit resources are less. And what do we do with that extra income that we have because it costs me less to buy the Nissan Sentra? Buy more things, right? Economic growth. So here's a big negative is each unit of each thing we have uses less resources than it used to, and we got lots more things, right? So, I mean, it would be nice if increased income, the only effect of increased income was increased environmental concern. But the other effect of increased income is increased purchases, right? It was the money spent, that we give to charity, right? I think in America it's like 3%, not even. That's on a good day. The amount of money that's spent on charity relative to the amount of money spent on goods and services, like 97%, right? So we have a big effect that way of, a negative effect. We just have more stuff, and more stuff means it came from somewhere, generally is extracted from the environment, right? Notice too, think about also, just try to think about what are the environmental effects of all the different kind of things when you talk about free trade. When two countries trade, when the U.S. and Mexico trade, what happens to relative wages? What should happen to them?
Equalize.
Eli?
Equalize?
They should equalize, right? Or that productivity, right? The dollars per production should equilibrate, right? So because at least to the extent that labor is the same fraction of the product we're producing, you should see some equilibration there. And what that means is, what happens to American, we'll use American Mexico, what happens to American wages? Go up or down? Down. What happens to Mexican wages? Go up. So the positive effect is in Mexico, more income, more environmental concern, but the flip side of that is, in America it should, if that's true, in America it should go the other way, right? All of a sudden, if we're all just lower middle class, we care less about the environment, hey, then, so the flip should happen, right? So let's kind of think through that process. Eli?
What if the U.S. starts specializing in like highly skilled labor, and so their wages increasing, whereas Mexico is specializing in low skilled labor, where their wages decreasing?
Right. Okay. So
right.
So that we have to look at the terms of trade, but at least to be aware of that as wages change, we want to see that the fact that this is not a one-way ratchet, right? That incomes can go up or down, and if incomes go down, we should expect less environmental concern. As people get poorer, and whether that's in Mexico or in the U.S., whichever one, right? We should expect their level of environment. So if it's in Mexico that the wages are going down, then in fact, however bad their environmental concern is before, it's even worse now, And I don't know, between you and me, kind of increasing income, if you look around here, my sense is increasing income has not led to a whole bunch of environmental concern in the Bay Area, right? That there's a hell of a lot more concern about buying more goods and services, right? All those nice new Bimmers and stuff you see out on the road and the $5 million houses. That's where the resources are. I think kind of this and a lot more stuff is going on. Certainly one of the things is a lot of throughout kind of in all of these things, a lot of the externalities, environmental externalities, are not being addressed in a lot of the economies in the world. And, it's this environmental regulation over here. The amount of environmental regulation is to some extent an attempt by governments to internalize externalities, right? And to the extent those are not occurring everywhere, you're going to have a lot more externalities being imposed on the environment in countries that don't have good regulation. Okay, so those are some of the differences. I think one of the things also in the debate to think about, when you think about the free trade debate in general, let alone the free trade and environment debate, is to think about both sides of the border. Okay, when people talked about, well, all the job loss in America, right, due to NAFTA, during the NAFTA debate. You know, people talked about all the jobs that were going to be lost in America. Well, in some ways you could say, great, that's a good thing. Why could you say that's a great thing? Because they must be going somewhere. And on average, if I'm a global citizen, I care about people having jobs, and I don't care if they're Americans or Mexicans. Right? And hey, if the Americans are losing their job to countries where, in fact, the labor content of a good is a lot higher, that means more people have a living. It may not be much more than it would have been otherwise, but more people are employed. That's a good thing, right? Or one can at least look at it that way. So I think it's just important to think about what are the effects in different countries in the world. So you want to think about the kinds of things that Kim was raising is what's happening in both countries, like kind of have a global perspective and try to look at what's happening to the environment net overall. And we may care about distribution, we may care about where it's happening, but I think it's worth wondering about, do we care on how many trees are left on the planet of the Earth, or do we care that different types of trees, that we want some temperate forest and boreal forest, or do we want tropical forest? Do we want some mix of those? How do you sort that out? And I don't think there's an easy answer to it, but you want to at least be thinking about those things and then making a judgment, having kind of sorted out this whole complex picture about the relationship of trade to the environment, to sort out what's your view on this. And it's complicated. One of the nice things you can do is something like this NAFTA article to say, yeah, it's complicated, but one of the neat things with empirically is you can just say, I don't know how all this works, but I can look at the correlation between free trade and the environment. What was their conclusion? Did anybody get a chance to read it?
It's sort of mixed.
Sort of mixed. Okay. Like mixed in what way? What kind of things do they use? Anybody, jump in. I mean, what is they use enforcement, right? So partly they're trying to look at what happened to Mexican enforcement of environmental regulations, and did it go up? And it actually did jump up. They don't have a long time stream historically, right? But they do see it goes up. They also say environmental environmental quality, not so much change, right? And then what's the nice, well, I hate asking leading questions like that, so I'll just read it to you. But good use of trying to estimate the counterfactual. It's just in the conclusion. One can make the case that Mexico's commitment to environmental improvement must have been genuine, or else Mexico would have cut back on environmental programs, especially inspections, very substantially during the economic crisis, right? During the peso crisis. Talk me through that. Why is that a good counterfactual? What do they say? What are they arguing? That what? How are they estimating the counterfactual? Eli?
Well, I guess since their environmental quality did stay similar, or did stay the same after free trade and before free trade, I guess would be a good case that they had a genuine interest in environmental quality, because I think it was 95 when the peso crisis hit that you would think like they would have abandoned a lot of the environmental laws to try to boost growth and boost their economy out of the slump.
So you have environmental quality going like this, right? That's the observed line. And what are they doing about putting in the counterfactual line? They're saying, well, here in 95, we had a thing called the peso crisis, right? And we can estimate that this kind of, whatever was happening here, it should have led to something like that, right? Because we would have less enforcement, less concern about the environment, an attempt to get rid of any subsidies for the environment and replace them with subsidies against the environment, and all of a sudden environmental quality would go back, or this is an environmental degradation graph, I guess, right? That environmental degradation was getting less and less, and then come the peso crisis, it should go up. But again, they're using something to estimate the counterfactual, right? To say what would the world have looked like without NAFTA, right? And they're saying without NAFTA and the commitment that instilled in protecting the environment, the peso crisis would have had different effects. Okay, so I think that's an important kind of thing to think through. So now I want to take this, okay, and say, okay, we have some relationship between free trade and the environment, and there's plenty of room for negatives right here. There's plenty of things that could make it so that free trade causes harm to the environment. So one thing is not to kind of dichotomize this, but to say, okay, given what we know about this relationship, how do we address the bumper sticker that says, not this NAFTA? So what should be the conditions we should impose on free trade in order to make sure that if we believe, I mean, we may not buy into the argument that free trade, forget the environment for a second, is free trade good? You know, you have to make arguments about labor, about both consumers, people as consumers and workers, right? That's kind of their two roles, right? And you have to decide, do you think it's good for you as a worker and do you think it's good for you as a consumer, right? And that's the trade-off, right? I mean, generally, free trade seems to be a good thing for the point of view of consumers, right? That is, more goods at less cost. That, on average, as a consumer, that's a good thing. Labor, less clear, depends which labor market you work in, whether you like it or not, right? If you're in a labor market that's well protected. So you want to worry about what's happening to labor, and the third thing you want to worry about is, but let's assume that you somehow come to a belief that free trade is good based on labor and consumer stuff, right? That we retrain labor to do what they do well in whatever country has comparative advantage. And we take care of all those equity issues. And then we want to say, okay, now, how do we regulate that notion of free trade so that we get environmental protection? So what are some kind of conditions that we want to have, that we want to place? I don't know, maybe I'll leave some of this up so that it can prompt you a little bit. And I don't have a ready answer here, but I think it's worth thinking about because it seems to me, like it or not, free trade be happening. Right? You know, I mean, wake up and smell the coffee, but the EU is just the beginning, right? This is how things are going to go. So what we can do is not say, don't like free trade, not going to deal with it. No, you got free trade, it's happening. How do you make it a good kind of free trade from an environmental perspective? Diana.
I was just going to say, the first thing I would do if I was in control of the international...
If you were God?
If I were God, is I wouldn't penalize environmental progress. And,
okay.
The one thing I know, the WTO, if the U.S. wants to, instill nets that exclude, dolphin catches when you're doing tuna, then by God, good.
Okay.
Tell them, slap the wrist and say, no, and you have to pay Indonesia, reparation or whatever for being environmentally progressive.
Okay, so first thing is don't punish environmental protectionism, right? And notice that this is really hard because, I mean, what's the argument, just to kind of say politically, what's the argument against Diana's view? Now, why does that get shot down every time it's brought up? Kari.
There are some people that have more money to spend on environmental progress, and so you're penalizing nations that can't implement things.
Okay, so one is an equity argument, and what do we think is actually masquerading behind that equity argument?
Economic protection.
Economic protection. This is Beth DeSombre just published a book called, it's basically Baptists and bootleggers, right? Think about during Prohibition, who liked Prohibition? The Baptists, who didn't like people drinking, and the bootleggers, who liked making the what are they called? Something rents, excessive rents, right? The excessive rents by having something banned, and they still provided the good by bootlegging, right? So you have some combination, and so in the tuna case that's been brought up, you have all the Greenpeaces of the world, right, who are pro-American view on tuna, and who else was pro it? Who else was pro American tuna? Yeah. Producers who fishers who were out there saying, hey, we like this protectionism, and keep other countries' tuna out of our market. And then we can charge excessive rents for that, right? Impose tariffs. So part of the problem is, how do you distinguish real concern for the environment from concern for the environment that's just covering up? And maybe what we say is, no, as long as there's a plausible argument for as long as the effect is that it protects the environment, then that's a good thing, and it doesn't care. If it also happens to protect some other economic interest, okay, we're willing to live with that.
But it wasn't simple. The U.S. not only did it distribute the technology and help implement nets in other countries, the three countries that brought the case to the WTO were the three that refused to meet with America to do the technology transfer.
Okay,
so
it's a complex story. It's because I've also heard from a Mexican friend that the other side was that they were actually protecting tunas, but not through the mechanism that the Americans dictated, and that they were providing the same outcome, but not through a process, so, but certainly something like, if we could tell the difference, right, that we shouldn't punish environmental protection, that's true environmental protectionism. And then empirically we may have difficult sorting that. Okay, other things, what else kind of should we do? Malika.
The EU is making Greece and some other countries and clean up before they can join the EU.
Okay. So the other is sort of international environmental rules, right? Whether they're at a regional level in a regional economic integration organization like the EU or NAFTA, to say, so do you have a NAFTA side agreement? You have a bunch of regulations on everything, a list as long as your arm about environmental protection within the EU of all these things you have to do. And part of it is being done on a basis of you can't come to our party if you're not dressed appropriately, right? That in all there's 15 members of the EU right now, there's 10 more that are on the list of countries like, the Baltic states, et cetera, who want in, right? Czech Republic, Hungary, et cetera, who want in. They're saying, dress up first. You got to have the right rules on the book. These are the environmental acquis, the acquis communautaire, the sort of rules of the road, right? That if you want to play by these, if you want to be at our party of the EU and get all the economic benefits, you have to take care of yourself and get dressed up before you join, not afterwards, okay? So compliance, what else would you say is got to be, okay, free trade, but here's the rules that we should impose on free trade. I mean, some kinds of international environment, and we have some of these. I mean, all these treaties we're reading about and all of the treaties you're studying are treaties that states have already agreed to. What else? Diana?
You can find a way to level the playing field, so to speak, set an international environmental standard. I mean, that's pretty clear cut. I mean, if it's possible, I mean.
And what do you mean by that?
I just mean that, you should have, like the US and Mexico do these standards, and even with NAFTA, sometimes that's not really clear what should apply where. Okay. So you should have just a clear set of rules on what is, environmental protection. Okay.
And one way, I mean, at least, if we're going to, be dreaming about how we're going to affect the economic world, why don't we dream big, right? Which would be, why not? Standards can only go up. Okay? Hey, why not? Why not just say, look, every time two countries get together, you compare environmental rules all the way down the list, and you say, whichever has the more stringent standard, that's the one that is for both. Not a bad approach, and it'd be nice to find that maybe in Mexico they have some more stringent environmental standards than we do on certain issues, and to say, oh, the U.S. has to adopt that. Megan.
Along the same lines, in terms of multinational corporations, if you tell the corporation you need to adhere to whichever country's environmental laws are strictest.
Okay.
So if you have a presence in 10 countries, then you have to bring your standards in all of the other 9 up to the highest level.
Okay, so multinationals must abide by stricter rules. I mean, one of the big areas we have this problem actually is in shipping, right? In shipping, you have what are the port state and the flag state. Okay, well, what's happened is, in fact, in a real pollution, and it's not clear that it's necessarily just a pollution haven, because it's also a kind of OSHA haven, for occupational safety and health, sort of havens for a bunch of things, but all of the ships, all the tankers and container ships now are registered with Liberia or Panama, like, I don't know, 30%. Actually, interesting use of, I just critiqued I was reading a review article, and somebody said, and this is, I think, and this is by a very smart lawyer and who I respect, friend, but wrong analysis. What's wrong with this analysis? They said, one paragraph, top of the page, says, 30% of all Liberian, 30% of all tankers out there in the world are registered as Liberian and Panama tankers. Okay, a third of all violations of environmental rules have been by ships that were flagged as Liberian or Panamanian tankers. What's wrong with that? And so look how bad these tankers are. Look how bad these Liberian and Panamanian tankers flagging in those countries is. What's wrong with that argument?
They're a third of the shipping force anyway.
Right, they're exactly the amount we would expect, right? There's a third of the ships are in Panama and Liberia, and a third of them get busted. Oh my God, look how bad they are. That's like saying, in fact, if it's like the logic is so simple. No, that's the base rate. That's exactly how many you would predict would be busted, right? And so we're not so it looks on average like, hey, they're no worse than anybody else. Maybe not a bad thing, right? And good that we redistribute wealth a little bit and give a little bit more money to Liberia and Panama, right? But I think at least make sure you pass that laugh test of, wow, 30%. Oh my God, 30%. That, get past that. If that's the only thing you take from this course, I'm not making those kind of arguments, I will be a happy man. Okay? Other things, other ways to do this.
What about open access to research? Would that sort of...
Open access, okay. So one would certainly be a sort of something we'd want is sharing research and maybe technology. Okay, and say, hey, on average, let's make there be another part of this that says, okay, we see you're producing environmentally damaging ways. Let's help, right? So to make sure that that's going to get complicated with, wait, why are you in America, why are you helping the Mexicans learn how to produce more efficiently? This is not a good thing from my point of view as an American producer, but there's lots of things that aren't great from an American producer's point of view that we do in international law. So, okay, so one would be sharing research and technology and promoting green, right? Okay. That's just an extension of subsidized green, right? What fraction of the EU's budget goes to the CAP, the Community Agriculture Program? 60%. Subsidizing farmers to do things they do poorly, right? What?
It came down.
What is it down at 59 now?
It's at like 55.
55. Okay, we call that progress, right? But I mean, and I don't think America's a hell of a lot better on this front, right? We're subsidizing our farmers all the time. Okay, so you want to say, okay, let's subsidize. Let's stop taxing bad things. I mean, let's stop taxing things we like income, right? Tax people who work. Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, that makes sense. So they work less. And subsidize and stop subsidizing brown things and tax. Why don't we tax I don't know. Here's an idea. How about gasoline? Let's tax carbon. Let's tax things we don't like. Let's tax things we want to produce less of in this world and subsidize things we want to produce more of. Megan.
One of the really amusing things in the context of free trade is that most of the money for subsidies in agriculture in the U.S. comes from trade restrictions.
Okay. Okay. So wait. Tell me the logic there.
They increase import taxes to the U.S. and give the money to the farmers.
Okay. So the tariffs come out of the French who actually can sell wine in the U.S. They pay tariffs for that wine to come in, and those tariffs are then given to the California wine producers.
To keep them, yeah.
Okay, to keep them competitive. So it's the worst of both worlds. That's a good option. Okay, not only screw it up once, but screw it up twice in the process. Okay, you can imagine some more like this. We're out of time, but I mean the sense of, okay, so what would the restrictions be that you would place on trade? What's the process you get engaged in so that we say free trade's going to happen? How do we manage it? We don't have to just accept it as free trade, all hands off, let the market work, but rather to say free trade, but you're going to tax all carbon at $50 a ton, embedded or not embedded. We're going to do that to help the climate change or whatever. So just kind of think about what are the rules. Why do we feel good about it in trade between the states within the U.S. and how do we make that happen at the international level? To just think about how do we take trade and say, one, we're not sure about what the relationship is, but there's at least some negative aspects of it. How do we mitigate those, given that trade's going to happen, and how do you walk through that process?